Good afternoon, Huskies, and welcome to our second of 4 Elevate Career Hacks online workshops. My name is Josh Prue, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at the Office of Alumni Relations, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Today's workshop features an annual contributor to our online workshops, John Brady of Protem Partners. John Brady and Protem Partners are the official UConn alumni preferred provider for career coaching and management consulting. Before we get going today, I just have a few housekeeping items to make sure that you are able to participate fully in our presentation today. First, there will be an opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the question box on your control panel. Feel free to type them in as you think of them, and we'll address as many as we can throughout the presentation. Second, a survey is going to be sent to you as follow-up. We always appreciate you filling this out and giving us the information that you are looking for so we can hopefully bring additional workshops like these to you in the upcoming year. Third, the presentation is going to be recorded. Please visit our YouTube page at youtube.com/UConn alumni sometime later this week to review this and other previously recorded presentations. Lastly, be sure to check out our events calendar for upcoming events, other Elevate programs at uconnalumni.com/events for opportunities within your local areas. That being said, let's get on with the show. Our presenter today is no stranger to the UConn alumni community. Many of you may have met John over the last month or two as we brought him to over 8 different alumni networks and cities through our Elevate Your Career Next Level programming this past February. For those that have not yet met him, John Brady is our keynote speaker and frequent media source on matters related to corporate and career performance. He's also the discreet architect of unconventional strategies that alter the direction of organizations and the executives who lead them. His mantra, change is good, growth is better, serves as the tagline for the firm, which now holds clients from 21 states, inclusive of Washington, D.C., and as far as London, United Kingdom. Mr. Brady's current and recent clients include senior managers and executives of Goldman Sachs, Aramark, Fidelity, AstraZeneca, Willis Towers Watson, Comcast, IBM, Chubb, and Thomson Reuters. Mr. Brady is a 23-year veteran of the education, banking, and technology sectors. His recent contributions include a lengthy tenure as executive director for numerous programs at the College Board, as well as chief operating officer of Hire Next Incorporated. He holds a BS in English Education and an MED in Higher Education Administration, both from the School of Education at Boston University. He also holds an MBA from the Olin Graduate School of Business from Babson College, which was recognized him as a distinguished alumnus in 2006. Beyond professional pursuits, Mr. Brady is a board member of the American Legion's Boy State program in Massachusetts, where he has served as a counselor and faculty member for over 27 years. He is also an adventure traveler, having explored over 30 nations on 6 continents. He's a native of Boston's South Shore, and he currently lives with his husband, Reverend Trent Williams, who serves as pastor and speech coach. The couple currently splits their residencies between College Station, Texas, as well as Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Thrilled to have you, John. Thanks for joining us once again this year, and we're excited about this really relevant topic.
Josh, thanks so much, and good day to everybody, wherever in the country or even the world you are. Thanks for joining us. A couple of notes just before we get started. In the interest of trying to reduce or even eliminate the potential for technical glitches here and there over the webinar, rather than do an actual streaming video feed, we're going to be doing the audio only. So the audio quality it's not ideal, but you can certainly hear the words, and it's the words that matter. It's the words that we're talking about. But while there's a little less dynamism on your screen, hoping that you'll still be focused and pay attention. I know whenever you're doing a webinar, it's easy to get distracted by so many things, emails, texts, and other things. But because the visuals aren't there, it's just that much easier to get the walkaways from the experience today and from the content if you're listening to the recordings as best you can. And with that, we'll jump right into things. It'll be a little tinny, but people should be able to hear it in the background. We've done a variation of this workshop in several different parts of the country, and it's gone over really well and gotten great reviews. So hopefully everybody will enjoy it. Just by way of framing what we're talking about here, and I think we did this in the description, but when we're talking about either TED Talks or just formal oratory in general, we're making a distinction from the kind of speaking and presenting that you might do in a typical business context or business presentation. Most of us in the workplace have to present facts, information, sometimes reports, and there's a little bit more colloquialism to it. It's a little bit less formal. Usually there's a little bit different kind of and even more casual interaction between people, but these are things that most of us get to practice. What we're talking about here today is when it's mostly you and the microphone. Maybe there are a few images, behind you. But formal speaking is something that used to be standard content in a lot of schools, even going into the 19th and maybe even early 20th century. But we've really gotten away from that. There are only a few professions like the politicians, clergy members, and others who really use the skill on a regular basis. But people are often very interested in learning how to speak formally, and often people will come to us in preparation for something like a TED Talk, whether it's a TED event in their city or in their particular industry, or even for the national TED event. And that's kind of what we were thinking about here, where there's formal planned remarks that has a slightly different cadence to it, and whether you're reading directly from the script or not, that for the most part, your word choice has even been planned out in advance. So with that, we're going to just jump into things here and go from there. One of the most famous speeches that just about everybody is familiar with is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. And certainly at key points in the year, his birthday, or at least when we observe Dr. King's birthday, we hear that one refrain repeated over and over again. And no surprise that as an orator, he was trained as a clergyman. And there are a lot of things that Dr. King does in that speech. Most people are familiar with the clip that shows repeatedly in newsreels, but very few folks have really listened to the speech in its entirety. And there are a few points where he goes a little bit off script and ad libs, but the "I have a dream" sentence is something he hits over and over again. He specifically frames a future state and brings a large number of people to it over and over again. One of the reasons that his speech is timeless is that most great speeches follow a formula. And we're going to talk a little bit about the formula that Dr. King and so many others have used in a few contexts, which includes film as well as politics and public policy. Now, using something from cinema, because we have a webinar, we don't have as much time as we would in a face-to-face workshop, but about 14 years ago, Warner Brothers released the film Troy, the cinematic Hollywood version of the story of Achilles. And they, of course, in Hollywood have all sorts of great lighting and costume people and score and music in the background. And we've got Brad Pitt with his flowing golden locks here, but they're able to do some really key things, even in a tiny little speech in what is less than a 30-second clip of a movie script. So I'm just going to play that briefly and walk through a couple of specifics from the framework that I'm referencing, and then we'll start jumping into some details. We'll use this as our kickoff point.
Prominent, my brothers of the sword, rather fight beside you than any army of thousands. Let no man forget how menacing we are. We are lions. You know what's there, waiting beyond that beach? Immortality. Take it. It's yours.
Now, you missed a few of the visuals, and in case your audio was coming in and out on your streaming a little bit, which is possible, we have Brad Pitt telling this tiny little group of warriors before they go and storm a beach that immortality is theirs when they make the beachhead, and they can just simply go and get it. And he does a few things in that brief 25 to 30-second clip, and the visuals are far less important than the words. There are a few things that he does. The first thing is his initial remarks are really very calm. He doesn't initially start yelling and screaming. He speaks to them in a relatively flat, audible tone, immediately relates to them using language that refers to them as brothers in a fraternal sort of way, speaking like he's one of them. But the most important thing he does in his clip, leaving all of the visuals aside, that of course we didn't share, is he, as Dr. King does, just in a less fancy way here in this fictionalized version, talks about something really big, in this case, eternity, infinity, kind of a big concept, but he immediately shrinks it by saying, it's right there, it's yours. You take that beach. We're far outnumbered, but you just do what you have to do, and you live forever in history. And what he does and what Dr. King does, while it may seem silly to compare those two things, are really very similar. A very grand vision that probably has a lot of complexity, a lot of difficulty, and then brings everything somewhat closer. All you have to do is this. Take this step, do this thing, whether it's appropriating money, casting the vote, taking the field in the case of athletics, certainly even in the case of battle, and taking to the streets to march, whatever the issue is, donating an extra $20. If you just do this, you can have an impact, you can make a difference, you can do something of substance. One thing he does not do is, despite in the film his portrayal as a man with a pretty big ego, he doesn't talk about himself. He talks about them and what they're able to do if they just do their job. And great speeches do something similar to that. Before you've written a single word, I think most people, when they want to write a speech, they immediately go into writing the words that they're thinking they're going to use. What you want is to initially have a really clear vision in your head of what you're telling your audience, your group of people, what you're wanting them to do, where you want them to go. Whether you eventually use those words and those words make it into your speech is largely irrelevant at that point. But you really want to be clear with yourself as you're planning what it is that you want them to do and what future vision they, as an audience person, can somehow relate to or connect with, and then you draw those things together. Now, there are in the film some nonverbal things that he does. He holds the tip of his spear one way initially, and then later on toward the end, he actually turns it with his hand, an outstretched hand, making it look like he's giving them the power and almost surrendering himself, despite the fact that he's a leader. There are a lot of things like that speakers will often do in terms of their nonverbal language. At one point, he even points to the beach when he says, just there, beyond that beach, immortality. He actually points to it as if it's just so close. So there are little things that one can do nonverbally, but it's always interesting to me when people are looking for speech coaching, they so often ask us for help with nonverbal things, whether they should pace across the stage, how they should be at a podium or a lectern, whether they should move the paper, and they've really missed the content and the development of what they put in there. And granted, in the cinematic example I've given you, while there is music and ideally a lot of visuals that help, the audio track still pretty much says it all in less than half a minute. Whenever you're giving a formal talk of any kind, which is even different from what I'm doing here, this is an educational setting. Although we don't get to interact in exactly the same way, I'm generally speaking just as I would if I were in the front of a classroom or auditorium or any other smaller familiar venue. But usually if you're giving some planned remarks, you want to try to keep things to that 10, 15, definitely no more than 20-minute window. 18 is probably the ideal amount of time. And there's just so much history around this. There's certainly plenty of research that supports it, but you really don't need a lot of peer-reviewed research. Folks who've been teaching this craft for a long time will pretty much always tell you, unless it's, a full keynote that for any one of a number of reasons might be expected to go 40, 45 minutes or an hour, those are pretty rare. Sometimes those things are appropriate for conference settings, but really, generally speaking, you've only got so much time, and 20 minutes is pretty much your limit, one way or the other. Dr. King certainly did this. I talked about language naming the world, the I Have a Dream, the Brad Pitt, Achilles example. immortality and the beach, but somehow you do want to tell a story. What's always interesting to me is when people go into formal speech writing, they will often begin giving an awful lot of facts or figures or trying to immediately justify their or support their and build their case the way one might do like a geometry proof, if you remember doing that in high school, and maybe have some less than pleasant memories of, or the way a lawyer might state a case, not so much necessarily to a jury in opening or closing arguments, but as they're more in the weeds of the case that they're building. In this case, you really want to find a way, whether it's brief, and by brief it could be 5 or 10 seconds, or it could be 5 minutes, have some narrative flow. Even people who are generally more fact-oriented, who usually want things distilled down to basic bullet points and something like a business presentation, folks who are in the STEM fields and maybe are not naturally inclined to go for length in their writing and in their words. It's still human nature to want a story to be told in some capacity. And however you do that, being able to decide which stories you're going to tell and which will illustrate the point effectively without taking people too far afield is usually going to work best. People, just human nature, we can't really help but listen to a good story or follow a good story. And like any story, your entire speech, if it's long enough, let's say you have a 15, 20-minute block of time, you can fit several stories into a speech of about that length, sometimes as many as 3 or 4, because you don't want the story to get so long that you're losing people, just so that you're building the case. So if you think about each little thought block as roughly 3 to 5 minutes, or what we'll call moves, or what many who are seminarians who plan to go into working as a member of the clergy in just about any religion will often learn as a move. It's basically a thought block that somehow communicates one piece of your idea. So if, in this case of that 30-second example, you really only have time for one thought block, which is on the other side of the beach is immortality. But if you have a lot more time, then depending on how much, somewhere in those 3 to 5 minute blocks, if you do that simple division, you can figure out about how many stories are likely to fit and hopefully string together. Each particular block has to fit the whole. So you're still not writing a single word yet. You're basically storyboarding. If you take each of those 3 to 5 minute concepts, and you want to make sure that just in your head, those blocks naturally seem to flow in building your case for whatever it is that you're looking for. And you want to make sure that it's clear. You want that connective tissue from each one of those thought blocks, each one of those moves, to bookend in some way with your theme. And that's one of the ways Dr. King did it in his was through just repetition of that phrase over and over again, the I have a dream phrase. But there are other ways that you can do it as well. Sometimes you can just state it outright. Sometimes you can find a more artful or different way of saying the same thing. But you want to keep bringing people back to your central theme so that they don't get lost in your ideas someplace. And I kind of pointed this map out already. In a 20-minute speech, you're going to probably fit somewhere between 4 and 5 of those thought blocks together. Now, within each one of those, you've got a beginning, middle, and end, just as you would with any story. And we're going to give another example of this because I realize this is pretty abstract. We'll give that in a moment. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do each of those thought blocks or each one of those miniature stories. You can use an actual image, on a slide behind you, a photo or a diagram of some kind. You can paint a picture or an image of a moment in time. It doesn't necessarily need to be a chronological flow. You can be kind of placing someone into an experience descriptively or telling a story just as one would imagine it flowing from, in the beginning to the end, so long as it's brief. And while you're doing it, you remember your audience is thinking, while you're taking them on this journey, And you're hoping that by telling them these stories or by giving these illustrations, people are kind of nodding and agreeing, even if only silently to themselves. You want to try and anticipate that there are people who aren't going to necessarily agree. And those things, while you certainly can't get everyone to see your point of view, the objections that you might be able to anticipate, you want to do exactly that and see if the stories that you're choosing or the illustrations that you're choosing somehow neutralize those objections. And there are a lot of different ways stylistically that a speaker can do this. The I have a dream that I've mentioned a few times, example of repetition because he says the same phrase over and over again. You can do more of a call and response kind of thing, whether it is literally asking the audience for some sort of feedback, even in the State of the Union every year or State of the State address, when the president or the governor, as is appropriate, makes strategic pauses, almost expecting the applause to come in here. That's a form of call and response, a form of anticipated interaction with the audience. You can do just about any of those things. So we're going to jump to another example, and I think the audio might be, or at least I hope will be a little bit easier for people to hear on this. This is the late Mario Cuomo speaking to the Democratic National Convention in 1984. It was one of the most famous political speeches, or most really considered one of the best speeches of his political career, but still stands out such that at, the Kennedy School at Harvard and other places, it's still often studied for its great oratory. And we're going to listen to not all of it, but parts of it that we've kind of edited out here and there, and we'll go on from that.
Francisco, the Democratic National Convention was held on July 16, 1984. Here, the keynote address by New York Governor Mario Cuomo featured the tale of two cities.
10 days ago, President Reagan admitted that although some people in this country seem to be doing well nowadays, others were unhappy, even worried about themselves, their families, and their futures. The President said that he didn't understand that fear. He said, why, this country is a shining city on a hill. And the President is right. In many ways, we are a shining city on a hill. But the hard truth is that not everyone is sharing in this city's splendor and glory. A shining city is perhaps all the President sees from the portico of the White House and the veranda of his ranch, where everyone seems to be doing well. But there's another city. There's another part of the shining city. The part where some people can't pay their mortgages, and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. In this part of the city, there are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it. Even worse, there are elderly people who tremble in the basements of the houses there. And there are people who sleep in the city streets, in the gutter, where the glitter doesn't show. There are ghettos where thousands of young people without a job or an education give their lives away to drug dealers every day. There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see, in the places that you don't visit, in your shining city. In fact, Mr. President, this is a nation. Mr. President, you ought to know that this nation is more a tale of two cities than it is just a shining city on a hill. Maybe, Mr. President, if you visited some more places, maybe if you went to Appalachia where some people still live in sheds, maybe if you went to Lackawanna where thousands of unemployed steel workers wonder why we subsidize foreign steel. Maybe, Mr. President, if you stopped in at a shelter in Chicago and spoke to the homeless there. Maybe, Mr. President, if you asked a woman who had been denied the help she needed to feed her children because you said you needed the money for a tax break for a millionaire or for a missile we couldn't afford to do.
Now that speech goes on. That was just about 3 minutes of the speech. It goes on for, if I remember, a good 20 minutes. You can certainly find it out on YouTube or any one of a number of public platforms in the public domain. But there are a few things that even just that little clip demonstrates that I've mentioned and hopefully makes pieces of this a little bit more real. Number one, he does use repetition. He says, Mr. President, for starters, over and over again, addressing the incumbents, in this case, Ronald Reagan, in 1984. And it's almost like he's just sort of hammering away at him again and again. But it's got that flow to it. Each time he kicks that off, it's like there's a new little thought block or move that Governor Cuomo is able to insert. The Shining City on a Hill speech has biblical history to it and a lot of political history to it for anyone who studied political science, and that's outside of our topic for today. But Cuomo, in this case, uses that repetition over and over again, using the president's words against him. In this particular instance, he relates to a whole group of people wherever he's able to, and he points out a very different comparison. There's the vision the president has set forth. Cuomo goes ahead and completely turns that vision upside down, really on its head, and then at other points in the speech then offers his alternative vision, the Democrats' alternative vision, in anticipation of the crescendo of the convention. So there's a lot of great examples in there. And if you find yourself going back, as Josh mentioned, over this recording and over those previous slides and some of those concepts, I know it's very difficult in a setting like this to follow the 8 or so bullets that I gave and then go to an example like that. But if you kind of toggle back and forth between those two things, you'll see some great examples from each of those. So just a handful of things from Cuomo's speech. If you were to imagine what those moves or thought blocks would be, if he were to storyboard this out before adding any words to it, the first is that America is in fact a shining city on a hill. But second move, not everyone is getting to participate in the same way. 3, he sort of paints the president as being out of touch, and he talks about the portico of the White House and really does the exact opposite of what I had talked about earlier. I said, you want to create this grand vision and then shrink it, which is what Cuomo does. But before he does that, first he creates distance from the president, which is his first goal, before he then sets an alternative vision forward. So he kind of takes that and also turns that on its head and inverts it. Second thought block or movement, our truth is we knew this was coming. We have a different vision as a political party for this city. I probably should have quotes around that. And then he raps. So again, you can find that out on the web if you wish. Each of these thought blocks are really how you should think about even things like business presentations, but it's super important when you're speaking, because more often than not, when you're speaking formally, all you have is your voice, or maybe you have a couple of visuals behind you to augment it, but usually no words. People have gotten so used to basically what I'm doing, having a slide deck with bullet points that support your ideas, almost trying to do some of the note taking for people. In this case, it's just you. So each of these thought blocks, whether it's a presentation or something else, whenever you're trying to get someone to move from one place to another, you want to make sure, just like if you were doing creative writing in the form of a story or a screenplay, you want to have that situation, complication, stating where the tension is, and then resolve it, or at least if you can't resolve and celebrate it by the end of the speech, what you may also do is leave it some of that distance closed, but just a little bit of tension, so there's still a desire to move forward, to somehow fix it, to donate that extra $20 or take that next step. We don't really have time for it today. I was going to do it on the webinar, but in the interest of kind of cutting this down, because this is a long time to just listen. Another example, Al Pacino loves in scripts to have his monologue moment somewhere on 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through a film. I often use the locker room speech from Oliver Stone's Any Given Sunday, the sort of halftime speech that he gives, and his metaphor is to a losing team that life is a game of inches. Those inches are everywhere, and we're gonna fight even if it's to the death to go get them. He talks about these very grand kinds of things, and then gets everybody rallied around the idea that, yeah, we've still got this great score gap we have to overcome in the 30 minutes that remain, or we lose the season. But there's this bounty. There's this idea that those inches are everywhere. We just have to capture them, and we have to make sure we're seeing them and capturing them together to get there. That's also, you can find it easily on YouTube. There are some vulgarities throughout the speech, but and the script, but I think most folks can understand and appreciate the art just the same. It works the same as any of the other examples I've given. We've already talked about gestures and nonverbals a little bit with the Brad Pitt example, but you just want to make sure that you don't have anything distracting in your nonverbals, that whatever physical movements, nonverbals that you do somehow are supporting the point that you're trying to make. Brad Pitt pointing to the beach that he wants them to take and stating that immortality is just on the other side of the sand. Your voice and your inflection can be used certainly strategically. You want to start out calm and you want to end calmly or close to calmly, but there's often somewhere, again, around about 2/3 of the way when you really get the crowd into something where you can raise your voice a little bit. It depends on what's culturally and situationally appropriate. If you're giving a formal speech at a conference, that might seem a little too heavy-handed or a little too evangelical to do, but there are other environments where working people up, like in the case of a locker room speech, is perfectly acceptable, because you really want to inject that kind of energy where you're almost screaming and the crowd is in their own way kind of screaming right along with you. But it can add to the experience if you use it strategically and correctly. And make sure that if you're changing your inflection and voice, that it naturally somehow parallels to that storyboarding, that spark line that we covered a few minutes ago, where there's going to be an ebb and flow in your voice, or the intensity of your voice, the cadence or pace of your voice, that it also makes sense with the words and the story. If the story or the movement, each of those story blocks should be hitting a peak or a crescendo, then if you're going to be increasing somehow the intensity of your verbals, that would be the place to do it. Because if those things somehow seem discordant or disconnect, it's not going to work so well for you. One of the things that I always do whenever I'm doing a presentation for UConn or anywhere, or even just kind of public service stuff, Josh mentioned the relationship that we have with UConn, and it's a big relationship for us. We spend more time helping Husky alums than any one other group of people. Most folks don't have experience hiring coaches, whether it's an executive coach or a career coach or a speech coach, but there are certain things I always tell people that anyone that you look at ought to have. Hopefully you'll give us a call, given our relationship with UConn of now probably 3 or 4 years. But if you've never done it before, anyone that you work with should be able to provide references from current or former clients. They should have a code of ethics that they're willing to share. They should really have transparency around just about everything. Their fee structure, exactly what they're charging for, a sense that there's even a pretty clear sense of your total spend over time, to the extent that they're able to get that information from you. Hopefully they're well networked with all the right related professions, not so much because I think that in and of itself is enough, but when you know, I know in our area, we often work with these like employment attorneys or therapists or whatever, depending on how people come. Sometimes people might be, you know, unhappy at work and they're feeling anxious or maybe even a little bit depressed, and a therapist might help them with that, but they can't help them change their work situation necessarily, but they can help them, you know, cope with the impact. Certainly employment attorneys often find folks who need help, but there are a lot of different referring professions. So if people are pretty well networked and well known, that usually gives you at least some idea of how seriously they take their work. You don't want to be under any pressure of any kind. And just remember that the outcome is always going to be about you. So any coach should be really cautious about what guarantees they offer. Always consider that you're always the product. The coach gets to be on the sidelines, but it's in this case the client or the athlete that takes the field, not the coach. If you want to learn a lot more about formal oratory specifically, the more modern resource that I'd probably recommend is Resonate, which came out a number of years ago. Nancy Duarte also does a TED Talk, fittingly, on this topic, but she took to writing a book. There's an ebook for the iPad if you're an iPad person, but there's some great examples that can go into much finer detail than I can in a webinar like this, but she covers a topic and then gives a great embedded video in that particular version of the book. So it's very simple to get that real world example to go with the abstract concept. If you really want to nerd out on this, the real classic homiletic moves and structures is what guides the way a lot of seminarians are trained. And it's pretty technical, and it is designed for a clergy person. So there is appropriately a lot of spiritual reference in it. But if you want to dig really deep into something like that, if you can find a copy of it, I'm not even sure if it's still in print, but you can always usually find a used copy somewhere. But they're both, they're in their own ways, great resources. And certainly if you have something coming up or you just want some specific help that's customized for you, you can always give us a call. If you need anything from me, you can find us through the UConn website. You can, you know, find our information on the web, and I've got it on the screen here. My name, the dial to the firm, as well as that email. That email gets checked at least once a day. So anything that comes in there should eventually make its way to me or one of my colleagues, and we'll make sure that we get back to you, usually within a business day or two. And I'm going to pause here because of a little technical glitch. There's one slide I'm missing, but Josh, there was some information I think you wanted to share with people, and I don't know if there's time for questions or not.
Absolutely, and thanks, John. What I'm doing now is I'm actually showing my screen for folks to talk about our next and upcoming webinar. And as I'm going over this, if folks do have questions, please feel free to jot those down in that question toolbar that all of you have. If there's anything specific you want to ask John, you can go ahead and enter those now, and we'll get to those right in a second. But what I did want to do is did want to mention, obviously, our next workshop that we've got coming up. It is actually fairly close to this one. It's only 2 weeks away. April 25th, same time, same bad place as they say. So it's Eastern time zone, 12 o'clock p.m., so 9 a.m. for our West Coast folks. Patrick Flaherty, which is the Assistant Director of Research and Information at the Connecticut Department of Labor, is going to be joining us, talking about some of the trends that are happening here in Connecticut. Obviously, some lighter stuff in terms of national impact and things that are happening since the Great Recession and how people are rebounding and what market trends that we're seeing, as well as some of the tools that are available to you, regardless of if you live in the state of Connecticut or if you live in any other state throughout the union. So he's going to talk about those things that the Connecticut Department of Labor provides and hopefully help you or a colleague of yours or a friend of yours or family member take advantage of some of those free resources that are available and some of the trending patterns that you can kind of look for to see what might be beneficial for you to explore in your market, in your area. So as we do that, what I will do is I'm going to actually leave that up here for the moment, and I'm going to see if there are any other questions that come through. John, one question that did come through is, when giving a formal speech of any sort, is there a timeline or a time frame that you should keep to maintain individuals' attention?
It really depends on the setting. There are places where I feel like you want to keep things to 7 to 10 minutes. The 20-minute guideline that I gave is definitely the outset, unless you have a particular setting that's really designed to go for an hour. Generally speaking, if you've got that 15 to 18 minutes, you're definitely hitting the limit. You can do a lot, as with the first example from the film Troy, in a matter of seconds. But I think for most of us, it's very hard to distill. So somewhere in that 10 to 20 minute timeline is probably the sweet spot, but it would depend on the setting. I'd probably need to know a little bit more about what kind of an environment it was going to be, how big it was, even the age of the folks there can all impact. The setting can make an impact. If you're giving a speech in the middle of a meal where there's a lot of clanging of silverware and dishes and other things, you've got a lot more to compete with versus, an auditorium style seating arrangement. So unfortunately, my answer is it depends. But if you'd like to reach out to me offline, give me some more information, I can probably give you some more specifics. But generally, that 10 to 18 minute and definitely 20-minute max is going to be your optimum for getting attention and holding people's attention if you've crafted it well.
The only other question that I can see at the moment, and if folks want to go ahead and bring those back in while I put John's contact details back up on the screen, and John, if you can go ahead and accept that just so that your contact info ends up back up here. The only other question is there anything that you would recommend when utilizing these skills for some form of business formal presentation? Is there something that we should do? Obviously, painting a picture and crescendo of tonality doesn't necessarily fit sometimes the business presentation that needs to occur because it's very factual based and things of that sort. Are there pieces that we should be focusing on for those type of discussions?
Absolutely, and that would be somehow storyboarding. But what I mean by that is making sure that if you've got data that it's telling a story, and that doesn't just mean that it's logical. I think people sort of interpret story as logical flow from one idea to the next. This is something where people can lose themselves in what's in front of them or what you're telling them for a moment. Even just a little bit of surprise in some way or other. But I think somewhere along the line, as we've all gotten used to distilling our facts and making sure that we've taken out any superfluous words from the text, or that we've made our slides look really attractive, really, really pretty in terms of the graphics, we lose that ability to help people kind of follow their way through and see an outcome. So any story that you're going to give is not only about about history or where you are, but how you can use that information for wherever it is they may want to go or need to go. That future state is important, even in a business presentation, because presumably if you're giving it, it's so that you can get something in return, whether it's budget support for something, whether it's to expand an idea from one department to a whole bunch of other departments, whatever that concept is. So story, future state, and somehow connect those two things.
All right. Thank you so much, John. And that looks like the last question for the day. So again, thank you very much, John, for joining us as always. Thank you to everybody as well who took the time to join us today. Just a reminder, this was recorded, so we'll get this up on our YouTube/alumni, our UConn alumni page very shortly, as soon as we can get it up there. And we will see everybody on April 25th if folks want to join us for Finding a Bright Future and Career in an Uncertain Time. John, thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to everybody next time.